You may remember a couple of years ago, Bloomberg took the unprecedented step of suing the Federal Reserve. Our case was about gaining access to information we believed should be public. Here, then, are the fruits of our efforts. They're the numbers the Federal Reserve said were too dangerous. Numbers that for the first time reveal the staggering sums the world's biggest banks borrowed from the Fed during the credit crisis. To get these numbers, Bloomberg fought the Fed all the way to the Supreme Court. Then we spent months crunching 29,000 pages of data and deciphering 18 giant spreadsheets. Here's what the Fed didn't want you to know. From August 2007 to April 2010, the central bank put $1.2 trillion of public money at risk in secret loans to financial institutions. Almost 400 companies, some of them controlled by foreign governments, borrowed at least $20 million a day from the Fed. Several needed more, much more, like Morgan Stanley. The Wall Street firm was so close to going bust in September 2008 that it tapped the Fed for $107 billion, the most of all. Then there's Royal Bank of Scotland. For 661 days, almost 2 whole years, the British lender owed the Fed an average of $21 billion. The central bank even helped Barclays buy Lehman Brothers' U.S. assets. We'll never know if the Fed was right, that releasing these numbers would have triggered a collapse of confidence in the financial system and chaos on Wall Street. All we know is the public had a right. Let's dig deeper now into those secrets of the Fed. Sara Eisen is here to name names, the banks that borrowed the most, and even some companies that got in on the action. Sara?
Erik, $1.2 trillion of public money from the Federal Reserve at the worst of times. Let's check out where it went. Here are the banks. Morgan Stanley borrowed the most during the crisis mode, $107 billion at the peak. It's almost 3 times Morgan Stanley's total profits over the last decade. Citigroup, Bank of America, even Goldman Sachs, which in 2007, by the way, was the most profitable firm in Wall Street history, borrowed $69 billion. Now, Morgan Stanley may have borrowed the most at the peak, which you can see right here. But actually, in the purple, you can see Citigroup borrowed for longer. From the first day of the program, Citi was in debt to the Federal Reserve 7 out of every 10 days from August 2007 through April 2010. Now, we also found out that companies borrowed from the Fed as well, led by General Electric, $16.1 billion. Ford, Toyota, and even Caterpillar had to borrow $360 million. Now, we calculated all of it, added all up, $1.2 trillion from the Federal Reserve, and we figured out that that represents 539 Olympic-sized swimming pools of $1 bills. Erik, this is more than 20 times the amount that the Fed has ever lent in history. The last big borrowing came from the Federal Reserve September 12, 2001, right after September 11th. But if you look at these numbers, that pales in comparison to what we saw during the crisis.
These dwarf not just that program, but the other emergency programs, the ones that we know a whole lot more about, say TARP, enacted by Congress. That was public. All of this was secret. We had, as we've pointed out, we had to sue the Fed to go and get this information. It wasn't just Bloomberg. We were joined by other media companies, Fox among them, for example, because the public does have a right to know. If we can know that much about TARP and so little about this, something feels not quite right.
And the Federal Reserve had said multiple times that it did not want to reveal the names. It did not want to stigmatize these banks and make them look like they were in weak positions. But here we are, the names of the Fed. And really, the 2 highlights here, Erik. Morgan Stanley borrowed the most during the peak of the crisis. Citigroup borrowed the longest.
Well, the other thing that we talked about a little bit earlier in the show, and we really need to bring back here, is the idea that it's not just American banks. You named some of them, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, but European banks as well. In fact, half of the biggest borrowers from the Fed were European banks, like the Royal Bank of Scotland. I mentioned it a little bit earlier. 661 days borrowing from the Fed, an average of $21 billion, but also up on that list, UBS, Dexia, another bank still on the ropes. Hypo Real Estate, the German bank. Okay, this is a staggering figure, folks. Hypo Real Estate borrowed $29 billion from the Fed. It only had 1,336 employees, so that was equivalent to $21 million per employee.
That's a loan from the Fed to a foreign bank. It's not even to an American bank. So the Fed clearly was backstopping the global financial system, and maybe that's one of the things that they didn't want us to know.
They also lent to foreign governments, which you can find all of this, by the way, on Bloomberg.com. We have a great graphic representation of how much each bank took from the Federal Reserve and foreign governments, including Korea and other governments that had to tap the Fed's loan facilities. It's an important point also that this was not just one program. This was a series of multiple programs. Citigroup, who borrowed the longest, took all 6 programs at one time. When the stock dropped below $3, it was tapping all 6 of the Fed's borrowing programs.
Plus the discount window.
Exactly.